Well, hello and welcome to this edition of Reading the Bible with Meaning. We are getting back into our studies now after a little bit of time away. Picking up with Genesis chapter 1. We started that study the last time I recorded, and I'm going to walk us through the rest of chapter 1. And one of my primary sources for some of the information in here is a book by a man named John Walton, an Old Testament scholar, called The Lost World of Genesis 1. And it turns out he has a whole series of these Lost World books that take a look at the biblical stories from a literary historical perspective. So what other literature does there exist outside the Bible that talk about similar events? And as he looks at the account from his perspective, he comes up with some different ways of looking at it. And I don't expect you to believe it, accept it, run away with it, but it's just another interesting way to look at the text. I find that when I look at the text through different lenses, look at the Bible through different lenses, I find things in it that I had not seen before. So that's what we're going to do as we dig into the text today. So let's begin with the word of prayer. Father, I do thank you for your word. I thank you for bringing us to this moment of study, and I do pray for myself and all those sharing in this study that your Spirit would guide and direct our thoughts and understanding. Lord, help us to be open to consider new ideas and look at the text in a different way, to find new meaning in it for our lives today. For we ask it in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so let's take a look at introduction. Again, it's been a little while, at least from my perspective, so we need to do a little bit of review. So Genesis 1 is best understood from the perspective of ancient cosmology, which is the study of the universe. And all ancient cosmologies are based on what's observable. They don't have a lot of scientific instruments in the ancient world, and so what they observe and they draw conclusions from it. Now, as we look at the text, the traditional view is that Moses wrote Genesis along with the other first four books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, it is possible that these stories go back to Moses and before, but Genesis does not identify the author, and that's important because it's not the author that we're concerned about here, other than the author is God. God is the focus of the story. He is he's the star of the drama, if you will, and everybody else is supporting cast. Now, as we think about when these things were written down, now remember, not written, but written down, oral stories taking written form, it's likely that the creation account was written down in the form that's come down to us today during the Babylonian Exile, when the exiles were collecting and writing their stories to establish to their own satisfaction that God was still at work, that even though he had cast them out of the land, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, God was still in control. So as we move into the narrative, we want to see a picture of God in complete control, working alone in creation. No other deities, no other gods exist apart from him. Now, as we look at the Genesis account, again, a lot of what we believe about it reflects ideas that are both ancient and modern. But the creation account is more interested in showing the purpose of creation than how it was made. What is its purpose? Now, the takeaway assertion in Genesis that permeates the rest of Scripture, the foundational belief, is that while God exists apart from creation, he has bound himself to it. He bound himself to humanity and to a particular group within humanity. Okay? So as we move into the narrative, we pick up with day 4. And days 4 through 6 describe God filling the domains, filling the areas that he has created on the first 3 days. So we move first to the skies. And God said, verse 14, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years." And we'll stop there mid-sentence, but I want to look at these all separately. So The lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day and the night describes the emergence of stars and planets in the night sky. All right, something we take for granted. But it's like people, ancients, looking up and noticing all these lights in the sky, and what do they mean? Now, the change in focus, where we had specific lights earlier, or if we had general lights in general, light in general, and now we're talking about specific bodies of light in the night sky, suggests that those stars and planets serve a purpose. Not the purpose to which many ancient religions, and still today astrology, puts it to use. We don't use it to predict the future or to divine what's going to happen in the world around us, but they serve to measure the seasons, to measure the passage of time. And also, of course, to distinguish the night sky from the sky during the daylight. So remember that in ancient cosmologies, ancient religions, there was the tendency to worship the lights in the sky, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, as heavenly beings, right? They move. They appear to move in the sky and appear to be active. So one of the things that the Hebrew account, the Genesis account, wants to do is assert that these are created objects, not deities, not gods. That they're created beings. They don't have any power, right? And that's important because Israel's enemies would be claiming that these gods they worshipped, represented by objects in the sky, had defeated the God of Israel. And one polemical part of the Genesis account is that these gods don't exist. These things in the sky are just that, things, not beings. So what do, right? They guide the passage of time. We know early on that one of the ways the ancients measured the seasons was by the lunar year. So watching the passage of the moon in the sky, and the moon cycle is 30 days, right? So that's where you come up with a lunar year, which is 11 days shorter than the solar year, the time it takes the sun to go around the planet. The ancients were aware of both ways of counting. But the moon, helps identify the seasons and also tells people when to plant. Right? They use the light of the full moon to their best advantage. Then verse 15 says, let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth, and it was so. So there's the purpose, to give light to the earth, light to see by night. Okay, so they're not beings in the sky seeking to influence human action. They are objects that God has put in the sky to serve a purpose. And it was so. And that tells us that the lights in the night sky serve that defined purpose in and for creation, and especially humanity. They are functioning as God intended them to function. Okay? They're not capricious gods. Verse 16, God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night, and he also made the stars. Now, you're going, well, it's poetry, right? Well, it is, but the choice of which words to use and which words not to use become very important. So in the Babylonian creation account, the Enuma Elish, there is no record of the creation of the sun or the moon. These are gods who exist to serve Marduk, the chief deity. Okay? So they're not created because they're already there. Now, I'm going to get back, that's what this next part is about, right? The phrase, the greater light, is used to describe the sun. Instead of the usual word, there is a word for sun in Hebrew, semes. But it resembles the name of a foreign deity, so they don't want a sun god, so they don't want to use that word. Again, the point is to emphasize the status of these objects in the sky as ordinary things created by God to serve a purpose. In fact, to serve humanity, not the other way around. And the phrase, the lesser light, the same thing is at work here. The Hebrew word for moon, yareah, resembles the name of a deity. So again, I hope that I'm not over making that point. Then it says, and God also made the stars, right? Assigning them a lesser role than the sun and the moon, countering the primary role they play as deities in other accounts, right? So again, very intentional here. And so you have, and finally, you have that statement that God made them. God made them. They are created, not uncreated. Okay, verse 17. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was so. Okay, so the assertion that God set them in the vault of the sky affirms that these are objects, not deities, made to serve God's purposes. Now again, however you want to think about modern cosmology, that's great, and I believe all that. But what we're looking at here is, what does this tell us about God and God's relationship to creation, not what does it tell us about creation. Okay, we have to look at it from the perspective of the ancient cosmology. And from the perspective of the ancients, they believe there was a solid dome, a structure covering the earth, okay, that kept the water, held back the waters. And so God, he puts lights in this dome during the day and during the night to serve humanity. Okay. So they're not just pretty twinkling lights in the night. They do serve a purpose, and they aid navigation. Ancient sailors eventually used the stars to navigate. Okay. Before that time, they stuck close to shore. And also, they give us an observable difference between the sky at night and the sky during the day. Because again, that's the most basic way to measure time, from dark to light to dark to light. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. Now, we have a bit of a dilemma in the text at this point, because now, with the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets, it is possible to measure the length of a day, a 24-hour day. But there's no evidence in the narratives to support a change in how the word day is used. Okay, so we're still thinking about the day as an undeterminable amount of time. So in day 4, God fills the domain that he made on day 1 when he separated the waters from the waters and established that open space that he then filled. Okay? God said, let the water teem with living creatures, let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So you remember what God did on day 2. Okay? Now he's separating the waters from the waters, and now he's going to fill them. Okay? Living creatures to fill the waters below the vault, and birds to fly in the atmosphere between the vault and the earth. Okay? So the atmosphere, he's populating the atmosphere. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Okay? Now, before we move on, I want you to keep day 2 in your mind for when we get to the story of Noah. It's going to figure. Okay? So what about these great creatures of the sea? Dragons, serpents, monsters, big creatures, right, that the ancients are going to look at with some degree of fear. Many of the ancients feared the sea because if you got out into the sea beyond the sight of land, you could easily get lost and die. So the sea was considered a chaotic place, in some ways an evil place. But here, of course, God is controlling it and controlling what's in it. Okay? So no need to read anything into that phrase, great creatures, except large beings. So again, the point is that God is in complete control of the seas and everything that is in it. There is no need to fear what God has created. when we see the phrase great creatures, the word throughout the narrative, throughout the Bible, it always refers to a large land or sea creature. And then because we don't want to spend a lot of time in details, the phrase "every living thing with which the water teems" refers to all other sea creatures that God made them. Okay? God caused them to be. That's probably even a better way to say it. God caused them to be. And then the phrase "every winged bird according to its kind" refers to the making of all the species that are classified as winged birds and animals. So anything that flies falls into this category, right? So God populating these realms that he has made. And then you have this statement. Remember, we just talking about creatures of the air and creatures of the sea. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth." So for the first time since saying, "Let there be light," God again speaks, first person. Blessing precedes command. He blesses them and then gives them their purpose. The blessing implying that God will be present with them as they fulfill that purpose. Interesting to think about that in terms of animals. But the essence of the blessing here is fertility, the ability to reproduce. And in the ancient world, that power belonged to God. That without God's help, no one can have children. Again, that's the way the ancient world thinks about it. And we'll see that idea played out when we get into the story of Adam and Eve beginning to have children. That will play out. So animals had one purpose in creation: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Okay, just reproduce. That's it. Fill up the earth. Okay, to what end? Well, we'll see. There was evening, there was morning, the fifth day. So day 5 ends with that usual summary statement. Verse 24, God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. So again, noticing the correspondence. Day 6 corresponds to day 3, as does the rest of the creation account up to day 7. God brought forth the land creatures. God made humankind in his image. And so now we're going to focus on those creatures. The dry ground that emerged when God calls the waters under the vault to be gathered into one place is the focus, right? So think about not water evaporating, but also water going down into the earth, okay? Subterranean water sources. Now, interesting, the categories here. Living creatures according to their kind. So talking about all the different species. The livestock. It's an interesting word. It's used in the Bible to talk about cattle and other large four-legged creatures, but many times to talk about domesticated animals. Creatures that move along the ground would be legless reptiles, insects, anything that crawls. The phrase wild animals includes all other land-based creatures. The word really means living things, okay? Every living thing, each according to its kind, would be more of a literal translation. So it's a blanket term, an umbrella term. What this verse is doing is giving us a summary statement of God's creative activity in bringing all the different species into being. Okay? And God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. God saw that it was good. So it's a summary statement, again, affirming that God made everything he intended to make according to his will and purpose. God did not bless the land-based creatures or command them to be fruitful and multiply as he did with the aquatic creatures. That's interesting. Very interesting. Don't know why. There's no answer for that. But God blesses the creatures with which he filled the skies and the seas, and will bless and issue the same command, not when he made the animals, but when he makes humanity. And so the animals, maybe all mammals are included in that blessing. I don't know. We'll see. But everything is good, right? God saw that it was good. Everything is purposeful. Everything is functioning the way it is supposed to function. So God designed creatures to reproduce themselves and fill their domain. That's the bit of creative act. Okay, so that's again a little bit. It just brings us to the end of that. God putting everything together to create a home for humankind, and that's the pinnacle. That's where we go next, right? So in verse 26a, first part of the verse, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." The word mankind, humanity. Okay. Now, the grammatical feature of the verse that's generated the most argument is the use of the plural in God's statement, right? God said, "Let us make." Wow. What do you do with that? Okay. Especially given the Hebrew belief that there is only one God. So why us? If it's there, there's a reason for it. Okay. Now, here's where we got to kind of, right, so figure out. Then God said, he said, singular. This is the narrator speaking. So from the narrator's perspective, God is one. Then God said, "Let us make." Okay, let us make. Now, there are at least 6 possibilities for interpretation and all kinds of sub-possibilities. The one that we are going to dismiss out of hand is that the plural refers to other deities, which would suggest that the editor of our account relied on the earliest form of the story. Maybe, okay? One possibility is that the plural refers to God's heavenly court, suggesting that he's speaking to his angelic court, the angels who attend him. Another possibility, God is speaking to the ground from which he formed the man. Just kind of a soliloquy. Let's get to work. Let's make man, right? Not that the ground is helping him, but the ground is part of that process. The possibility that makes the most sense, really, is that it's a plural of majesty, a form of it. And that's supported by the plural form of the word translated God, which is Elohim. El is the singular, Elohim is the plural. So Genesis 2 says, then Elohim said. But said, again, is third person singular. So I think that a form of that, a plural of fullness, suggesting a plurality within the Godhead, a linguistic way of saying that the singular cannot contain the fullness of God. It could be a plural of deliberation too, God just talking to himself. But in the plural of fullness, Christians find evidence for the Trinity at this stage in the biblical narrative. So, again, you're reading into it, but it's not impossible based on how belief later developed. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness," right? So God's creative activity is introduced mostly by the phrase, "let there be," if you remember the earlier part of Genesis. Here the phrase is, "let us make." Okay, so grammatically what the writer is trying to do is tell us that something special is about to happen. Here too, we run into a little bit of I don't know, not difficulty's not the right word, but an interesting little thing to think about. The Hebrew word translated make can be understood in both a material and a functional sense. Right? To make someone do something functionally, right? And I think both are present, because there is the sense that God has ownership over humanity because he made humanity. But there's also a functional sense that God set humanity apart for a special purpose. Of all his creatures, he set them apart for a purpose. But we have to get to the heart of the matter, which is, what does it mean to make mankind in God's image and God's likeness? Lots of discussion, lots of argument, lots of back and forth, lots of misinterpretations. And examining the language sometimes doesn't help us because some of the phrases don't occur very often. Image of God, for instance. 4 other times in the Old Testament, 2 of them right here in the creation account. In Genesis 5:3, we learn that Adam fathered a son in his own likeness, in his own image. Isn't that interesting? That Adam understood that what he and Eve had done was to create a human being like him. Okay? And we're not just talking about physical appearance. In Genesis 9:6, in God's covenant with Noah, we're reminded that God made humanity in his image. So it's a rare thing. Okay? So we take it apart, right? The Hebrew word translated likeness does suggest a similarity of appearance. Now, but the word for image is used in both a negative and a positive sense. Now, the Greek word that's often used to translate image in the Bible is the word for idol. Okay? A physical representation of a deity. And the Hebrew Bible takes that in a quite the negative sense. That one is not allowed to make idols or images of God. Now, there's a neutral sense too, which could be positive. In 2 Samuel 6:5 and 6:11, where we read a description of the images or models of mice and tumors with which God inflicted the Philistines while they held the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark is captured by the Philistines and they carry it off as a spoil of war, and Israel is so beaten down that they don't bother to even try to go get it, so the Ark rescues itself. And in the process gives the Philistines a really bad case of hemorrhoids. That's one of the ways you can translate the word, that's tumors, and a plague of mice. And so God takes care of it all by himself. And when they consult their wise men about returning the ark, the wise men say, make golden images of these things that afflicted you and send them back as an offering. It's a hilarious story, but it's so because it's just so true to human nature. But back as a bunny trail, back to the question at hand. What does it mean to say that humanity is created in the image of God? Right. So we like to focus on the material side of that. That's not. We can't do that. That's not. God doesn't have a form. But in Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures, the phrase image of God was used to refer to kings, so a royal title. But there was, certainly in Egypt, and I think too in Mesopotamia, there was this tendency amongst rulers to claim that they were descended from gods. So image of God does take on a bit of a more complex meaning. But if that usage is in play here, then to say that mankind is made in the image of God is nothing more than a designation of humanity as royal or special in God's eyes. Okay? Could be. But the word likeness appears only in the initial statement, right? So we talk about, we move on, we talk more about being made in the image of God. So the word image is probably more important in the narrative than the word likeness. So we got to drill down. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Now, it's probably an abstract because you have image and likeness, it probably adds an abstract meaning to the word image, making it somewhat less than concrete. When Ezekiel tries to describe his vision, he uses the word likeness to say, I saw something like. And when we get into the book of Revelation, we see that as well. I saw something like. So you can see it, but you can't describe it. Okay? So it's not a physically descriptive term to say that we're made in the image of God. Now, another interpretation suggests that the word likeness strengthens the word translated image to imply a link between humanity and God. And there is a link. And that link will be spelled out in the story of the making of the man. Now, prepositions are important in the Bible, if you knew that, but prepositions are attached to both words and lend meaning to them. One suggested interpretation of the entire phrase is, let us make man to be our image, to function in God, as God's representative in his creation. Okay? Let us make man to be our image in creation. Function as his representatives. Okay? Not to represent him physically, but to represent him as in his rule over creation. So when we talk about being made in the image and likeness of God, being made in the image of God, we're talking about a similarity of function, not appearance. Okay? The statement that God created humanity in his image is reported and not defined. And that's frustrating for us, but likely intentional, because the Bible doesn't want us to get all knotted up about what is that. Does God look like us? Do we look like God? But to use it as a way of talking about our relationship. We have a functional relationship with God in his creation. Okay? So that they may rule over the fish in the seas and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. And that phrase, to rule over or have dominion over, as some of the older translations put it, is a relational term. Now, after the fall, it's used to describe negative relationships. Okay? Rule or dominion, in its original way of understanding it, or in a positive sense, implies the expectation of service, care, and provision. 1 Kings 5:4, we're talking about what the kings are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to serve, care for, and provide for their people. But tyrannical dominion, ruling with an iron fist, that's not it. What this means in terms of humanity is that we are to rule over creation by caring for creation on God's behalf, because we're going to have to answer for what we've done and how we've treated the creation. There's just no way to get around that. So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Right? So the narrative returns to the third person to describe what God is doing and has done. Humanity, unlike God, is described as both male and female. Okay? Right? In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. The semicolon is important. The separation there is represented grammatically. Okay? God is not male and female. When it talks about the image of God, that's something else. Okay? So the order of the phrasing, again, is important. In the image of God, he made them. So there's that relationship between God and humanity. Male and female, he created them, talks about the relationship between a man and a woman. Okay, and one of the original purposes is going to be to fill the earth and subdue it, right? And so, according to God's economy and the way creation is set up, we need a male and a female to reproduce. Okay. So that latter phrase connects the assertion that God created humanity in his image and the commands in the following verse. He created them to be in relationship with him. He created them to be in relationship with one another and creation. So verse 28. So God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Right, so two basic functions, believe it or not. Okay, first, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. So that's not going to happen till after the fall. Okay, rule over every living creature. Again, that's humanity's role, and that does not go away after the fall. We still have that job, we still have that purpose. We're just doing it outside of the Garden of Eden. So God blessed and enabled humanity to reproduce itself, a function built into human beings and governed by God, not other deities. Now, having said what I said about reproduction, one of the things we want to think about, okay, as we move into the next chapter, which I'll do in the next study, is to think about when did humanity start to fulfill that command. Now, Adam and Eve and their family did not begin fulfilling that command until after they left Eden. Don't know if that means they couldn't while they were in Eden, or they just didn't while they were in Eden. Don't know. But when we come to Genesis 3, what we discover is that there were other people on the planet. Now, did God make them? It could be. Yeah, it could be. Or does this represent the part of humanity that began to fulfill the commands before Adam and Eve fell? Something to think about. Okay. But again, the premise there, and it doesn't cause any problems. The premise there is that Adam and Eve were not the first or only people that God created. They don't really have to be. Because when we move to Adam and Eve, we're moving into the story of the family of God. Adam and Eve are stand at the beginning of that family. And they extend through, right? If you look at the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, Luke traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam. All the way back to Adam. Treating Adam, incidentally, as a real person. So for the purposes of Scripture, we need to do that too when we're engaging in the narrative. Okay, real people. So God establishes all of this. He creates humanity, okay? Starts the ball rolling, but he's not done. Because now God is going to begin the process of creating that his special people. The Genesis narrative is concerned to show us Adam and Eve beginning the creation of what became Israel. Okay, so that's all important as we think about it. Back to the thing here. Note that ruling over every living creature doesn't include killing them, right? The word subdue doesn't mean to kill. The word subdue means in some sense to control, okay? But also to care for, okay? Later on, God will say that he made plants and fruit-bearing trees to give nourishment to his creatures, including humanity. Okay? The word subdue, again, a negative connotation, but likely, again, in this case, implies tilling the soil, the task that God gives to Adam. The Babylonian account, the Enuma Elish, describes Marduk assigning deities who sided with Tiamat, the evil goddess Tiamat, to the task of maintaining the earth by their labor, which was considered a punishment. Eventually the gods are going to go, I don't want to do this anymore. So Marduk created humanity from the blood of another deity, conveniently killed, a fallen god named Kingu, as servants of the gods. That's in these other accounts. That's why humanity exists, to serve the gods at their whim, right? At their whim. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. Right, so this is what I was talking about just a minute ago. God's provision of every seed-bearing plant and every tree that has fruit with seed in it for food suggests that the taking of life for food was not allowed, not part of the original design. I think that's important, because if God had originally intended humanity to eat meat, it would have said so. And that doesn't mean we have to give up our hamburger, right? I'm just saying in the original, at the original design, right, we were vegetarian. Everything else was too. All living creatures. Okay. So that sets the stage, though, for the later declaration that blood is sacred. It's a symbol of life, okay? Not to be shed lightly. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. Again, suggesting not just humanity, but every creature ate vegetation. Now, what's interesting as well here is that the story of Cain and Abel suggests that while living creatures had the ability to kill, God did not allow it to happen before the fall, right? Killing is a consequence of the fall. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Love that word, very good, that phrase. It can be rendered very beautiful, and that might be better. That might be better. Very beautiful. Functioning beautifully. Okay. Now notice here it says the sixth day, not a sixth day. All the preceding references to the passage of a day use the indefinite article to refer to it, a day. And that's not always translated as such in the English versions. But to say the sixth day sets it apart. Okay? It's the pinnacle of God's creative activity. Note also that the creative activity on day 6 is described in much more detail than the other days of creation. So in chapter 2, we return to day 6, okay, to describe in detail the creation of humanity. But again, there's a couple of different ways we can look at that, and we will do that when we get into the narrative. Okay? I'll give you all the different ways to think about it. All right? So let's close in prayer. Father, I do thank you for your word, for your presence in it, and your presence in us. I thank you for your Spirit that guides us as we read and interpret and understand. So be with us, Lord, in this sacred endeavor, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so hopefully we'll get something posted up again soon, and in the meantime, God bless.